Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Royal Army Museum in Brussels, part of the Belgian War Heritage Institute, taking a look at some of the particularly rare and interesting firearms from their reference collection. And today, we have a fascinating Mosin Nagant prototype. This is one of the Kholodovskii rifles. Now, the origin of this basically starts with the Russo-Japanese War, which of course doesn't go well for the Russian army. And in its aftermath, the GAU, the Russian Artillery Directorate, who is in charge of small arms development as well as artillery, they decide to try and get some feedbacks from troops on what the problems were with the M91 Mosin. How can we improve this rifle? What needs to be improved? And the feedback they got was basically the elements of the M91 that ought to be improved were pretty much limited to the weight. It was too heavy, the awkward handling, it was too long, the trigger wasn't very good, the sights were subpar, stripper clips were awkward and difficult to load, the safety was unpleasant, it was difficult to use, and the bayonet wasn't very good. So in other words, every single significant aspect of the rifle people thought ought to be improved. Well, what the GAU did was they turned to the artillery committee and told them to start working with the Tula Arsenal to address some of this. Like, let's come up with something better. Let's make some improvements. And this is where Lieutenant General Kholodovskii comes in. He had done some of the original work on the M91. He'd done some of the ballistics tabulation for it, setting up the sights. He was very interested in small arms development. He also had significant political connections to the Romanov family, which certainly didn't hurt. And he ended up getting the job of designing the improved version of the Mosin. Now, the idea was this was to be a series of improvements that could be retrofitted onto existing rifles to make them all better. And this is what Kholodovskii came up with. And like I said, on paper, this is like the be-all and end-all of Mosin Nagant firearms. Every single aspect of this rifle has been improved, or at least sounds like it's been improved. So let's take a closer look. Let me show you all the cool things that Kholodovskii came up with to put into this gun. We'll go ahead and start at the muzzle and work our way backwards. There is a lot to cover because virtually every aspect of this rifle was changed to improve it. But sort of the general overview, the story that's going to repeat itself as we look at the different features is spending a lot of money on a system that seems better on paper, but will it actually perform better in the field? So the front sight here was substantially redesigned. It's got these two little wings for, it's not really clear to me exactly what. They went ahead and put a silver colored insert on the front post, and that was done so that you would have better sight visibility in low light. The problem with that, one of the problems, aside from the expense, was that they used to be able to fine-tune Mosin Nagant M91 sight zero by grinding down the top of the front sight post if you need to change your elevation slightly. Well, you can't do that with that sort of insert on the sight. So that pros and cons both there. The cleaning rod was replaced with an aluminum cleaning rod. It still had a steel head, but the body of the rod was aluminum to save weight. There are a lot of small elements here that were done to save weight. They also instituted a spring-loaded cleaning rod retainer system that would have some problems actually working in the field. Now, it's interesting to point out here that there are two front barrel bands, and there's actually, well, there are four barrel bands total, two at the front, one in the middle, and one at the rear. And the idea was this barrel band right here is pretty tight, and that's supposed to hold the front of the barrel nice and snug onto the stock. The middle three barrel bands are all deliberately quite loose. So you can see this wobbles around very easily. That was done to retain the upper handguard, but they specifically did not want to put any pressure on the barrel to avoid problems with zero. There were a lot of one of the other things besides weight was an attempt to improve accuracy in the rifles. So we'll pull these barrel bands off in a moment and you'll get a closer look at that. There were 12 flutes that were machined into the barrel around its circumference. They go back about halfway. You'll see that again when I take the barrel bands off. That was done to reduce weight as well. And in total, they did manage to cut 550 grams, or about 1 pound, off the weight of the M91. Oh, I should also say the barrel is slightly shorter than an M91. It's about 1 3/8 inches shorter, 33 millimeters was cut off. Now, that brings it back to the shortened, only, quote unquote, 30-inch long barrel, 763 millimeters. So still a very long rifle. Here's our middle barrel band. Again, deliberately very loose. The sling escutcheons have been made out of aluminum, as are these barrel band springs, again to reduce weight. At significant expense, aluminum was not a cheap material at this point. We have our rear spring there. The rear sight is substantially more complex to manufacture than the original M91. At this point, they would have replaced all of the rear sights, or they were in the process of replacing the rear sights with the Konovalev rear sight, the slightly arched one for the Spitzer ammunition that was adopted. This is kind of a more typical style of rear sight. It's graduated up to, well, you can see here, 3,300 Arshin, but basically on the same original rear sight block. Like the Dragoon rifles, the range measurements, the range settings were actually marked into the handguard here. So you can push in both the buttons, adjust that V-notch, and then of course you've also got your battle sight V-notch right there. There is a rear collar on the handguard, and these are all aluminum reinforcing brackets on the inside held in place by these two rivets. So this is a stronger handguard than the Dragoon rifles. Still a bit fragile right here in the center where it goes around the rear sight. This is a very interesting thing that was put on the bottom of the stock. This was apparently a bracket that was made to work with some sort of clip to attach the rifle to the soldier's waist belt. I haven't been able to find any reference to show pictures of what that was, or more detailed explanation of how it was supposed to work, but that was the idea. The recoil bolt has been replaced with an aluminum one. One of the perhaps slightly more sensible ideas is they cut a thumb relief in the side of the receiver so that when you were loading stripper clips, you had a place for your thumb to go down to make it a little easier to push stripper clips in. They also lengthened the bolt handle fairly substantially. For comparison, here's a standard M91 receiver, and there's your thumb cutout. Again, for comparison, there's a standard M91 bolt compared to the longer Kholodovskii bolt. When I go to close the bolt, I now can't, because they added a bolt hold open to the magazine follower. Something that was done very commonly on Mausers and other military rifles. The follower basically just sticks up a little bit higher and interferes with the bolt, so that when the magazine is empty, you know it. You can't close the bolt, and you know to reload. The rear grasping surface on the cocking knob was made substantially larger, and this was done so that it would be easier to grasp, to operate, because that is the Mosin Nagant safety. So the mechanism of the safety was not changed, but you were given a little more material to grab onto there. The stock has actually been narrowed back here. You can see it expands back out for a wider butt plate. And the length of pull was actually made adjustable. So there are two inserts in this stock. You can take the two butt plate screws out and add or remove these inserts to get an appropriate, exactly nice length of pull for each individual soldier. That's a neat feature that was definitely ahead of its time. Also an expensive thing to do for all the rifles. It's a little bit hard to distinguish, but the angle of the stock was actually dropped 3 degrees. This was felt that it would give the gun better handling and thus better practical accuracy. One interesting change that I skipped over that we'll come back to now is the breech face was actually moved 6.3 millimeters deeper into the receiver. So the distance from here up to the actual base of the barrel was lengthened, and that by seating, I think the idea was that by seating the bolt and the cartridge deeper inside there, you're offering a little bit better protection to the shooter in case of a ruptured cartridge. If I bring back our standard bolt, you can see that difference in length up here. The locking lug location stays the same because these rifles are being assembled on existing modified receivers and barrels, so they didn't want to move the locking lug location. But the length of the bolt head has been extended on the Kholodovskiis. Also, in the interest of increased accuracy, the trigger was redesigned to be a two-stage trigger, and it really is a fairly nice two-stage trigger. The second stage is heavy, but you've got a nice take up in the first stage and then a fairly crisp pull. A little heavy second stage, but fairly crisp second stage. Definitely better than the standard Mosin Nagant trigger. Okay, so I've pulled the stock and action apart, and there are a couple things I can show you in here. We have a block added here, an aluminum block behind the recoil lug of the receiver. We have a pair of aluminum cylinders, aluminum spacers basically, that were added as mounting blocks for the receiver. So when you tighten the receiver down onto the stock, you end up hitting these aluminum supports instead of just pressing it into the wood. And this was done to improve the accuracy. This isn't quite pillar bedding, but it's on the way towards that sort of idea. Taking a look at the barrel, you can see the fluting here, which extends back actually a little more than halfway. And this was a pre-existing barrel. They took the barrel off and cut these flutes into it to reduce the weight by not really all that much. But, you know, between all of the weight reductions that they did, they brought the weight down a decent amount. Once we have the handguard off, you can see that this was originally a Sestroriesk barrel made in 1902. And the receiver here is also, that 902 is a 1902 manufacture of the receiver. You can see the new trigger mechanism here. They added a third component in the back of the trigger and a two-leg spring. So the original simply pulled this sear down when you pulled the trigger back against this single flat spring. On the new trigger, your first stage brings the trigger up into this rear sear, and then the second stage actually drops the sear. I can also show you in detail here how that magazine hold open worked. Essentially, what they did was modify the follower to lift up a little bit higher. So this is a standard magazine. This is the Kholodovskii magazine. And you can see the difference in positioning of these two parts. We have a nice little sharp catch on the back of the Kholodovskii magazine follower. And then they cut a notch in the front bolt lug right there. So when the magazine is empty, that is going to catch right there on the bolt, and that's what locks it open. So where did this all end up going? Well, in March of 1912, 200 examples of the Kholodovskii system are ordered. It was 150 rifles and 50 carbines. However, in May of the same year, that order was revised for unclear reasons to 288 rifles and no carbines. They went ahead and started production. It would take more than a year to actually produce those 288 guns. They weren't actually delivered until July 31st, 1913. And there was a tremendous amount of bickering and infighting and just all sorts of problems at Tula in the development, the production process of this. Kholodovskii did not get along well with Kul, whose name I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, the director of the Tula Arsenal. There were materials, in particular, there were materials problems. Like for a while, they were having trouble with burst barrels, which is a little bit unusual because these are built on existing Mosins, which one would expect to have all passed proof already. But they had significant problems with burst barrels. At one point, Kholodovskii wanted to kind of pull some strings and do a personal demonstration of the new rifles to the Romanov family, and the Arsenal director was concerned that the guns were not ready for this and ended up threatening to press charges of endangering the royal family because of the barrel bursting problems if this trial demonstration went forward. Ultimately, the idea was scrapped. And finally, all the guns are actually delivered. The first 10 are tested by Tula, and the report is basically that for all of the improvements to the gun, it doesn't actually perform any better. Another 120 guns are then sent out to the 1st Infantry Regiment for field testing. And the reports back are not quite that grim, but the reports back are not particularly positive. These guns still had significant problems. For all of the changes, again, the guns didn't actually perform any better on accuracy testing than the standard M91s had. They had reliability issues. The gun, they would have failures to feed properly if the action was worked slowly. Like, gun wasn't really ready. It wasn't effective. It certainly didn't justify the massive cost that went into all of these changes. And one can only imagine the cost of retrofitting all of these features onto existing Mosins. Like, just the barrel fluting, going in and pulling the actions apart and adding that little bit of barrel fluting to 4 million existing, or probably 6 million at that point, existing Mosin Nagants is kind of mind-boggling. So Tula basically looked at this and went, well, this is all a waste of time, forget it. But Kholodovskii's political connections came back into play again, and the result of this rather poor field testing report was that 5,000 of the guns were ordered in November of 1913. And then the following spring, I think it was May of 1914, that order gets upped to 32,000 because of politics. Well, I hate to say it, fortunately, World War I happened. Well, World War I interrupted this cycle of political corruption. And with war looming, the Tula Arsenal upped its production of all of the other standard weapons that it was already making. Things like 1895 Nagant revolvers and standard M91s and machine guns. And they didn't really have the production capacity to go make thousands of these new rifles. Before the outbreak of war, the order was finally, someone came to their senses. They reduced the order to 4,000, of which, interestingly, 500 were going to be carbines. That was then put on hold by the outbreak of war. Ultimately, in the middle of 1916, the whole project was formally scrapped, with none of the production guns ever having actually been manufactured. Now, there was a plan. Some people did look at this and say, there are actually some reasonable improvements from this rifle that we could take off and we could apply to other guns without a massive cost investment. There were 5 things in particular. Those were the safety knob, the bolt handle, the lengthened bolt handle, the bolt hold open on the magazine follower, the spring-loaded cleaning rod retainer, and the thumb cutout in the receiver. And those all would have been reasonable things to retrofit, and they are legitimate improvements to the rifle. But ultimately, none of those ended up going anywhere either. So the Russians would eventually manage to improve on the M91 Mosin, and that would take the form of the 9130. So it's interesting to look at the 9130 compared to this rifle, because the changes seem much less significant, and yet it did lead to practical improvements. The 9130 does have somewhat better sights. It's actually a cheaper gun to make than the original M91, which is a factor that one shouldn't that's important. It may not be relevant to the individual soldier using the rifle, but the ability to actually produce them in large scale and get them into the hands of that soldier is largely dependent on the cost. If it's too expensive and you don't make any, then it doesn't really matter what the improvements are, because no soldier will ever see them. At any rate, the 9130 was actually even shorter than this, handles more nicely than this, and that's what would ultimately be the improved version of the Mosin in Russian service. So, these rifles are stupendously rare today. Very few of them have actually survived, of the only 288 that were ever made in the first place. So a big thanks to the Belgian Army Museum here for giving me the opportunity to take a look at this and show it to you guys. If you are ever have some time in Brussels, I would highly recommend stopping by the museum and checking it out. They have a whole series of exhibit galleries with a ton of cool artifacts on display. It's, in many ways, it's one of the relatively few remaining old school military museums with all sorts of guns and uniforms and artillery and vehicles and other stuff on display. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.